Masechet Baba Batra Daf Nun Gimel 53. We're talking about chazakah in the sense of making an acquisition, actually doing an act in order to transfer property from someone else's domain into mine, or from hefker into my domain. And so the Mishnah listed a number of things. If I lock the gate around a certain area, or if I build up the fence, or make a breach in the fence. And it said kol shehu, even a little bit, even if I build it a little or make a small breach in the fence, that's considered an act that an owner would do on a field, and that is sufficient to acquire the field, of course, assuming that the person is giving me the field or selling me the field, or if it doesn't belong to anybody, that I'm intending to go and take the field for myself. So it's not enough just to say this is my field, or for the seller to say it's your field, but rather I have to go also and do one of these actions. So now we start off asking, V'kama kol shehu, what does that mean that even if you build the fence or break the fence a little bit? How much is a little bit? Kidi Shmuel, Damar Shmuel, Gadar Gader v'ishlimo la'asara, ufaras pirsa kedei sheikanes v'yaseh ba, harezo hazaka. Shmuel explained, if I built a fence and I completed it now to be 10 tefachim high. Before that it was lower. We'll talk about in a second how much lower, but now it's 10 tefachim. 10 tefachim is the standard height of a barrier for lots of different areas of halacha, to be a wall, including for Shabbat, to make an aruv, or to separate parts of a field, for kilayim, or the height of a wall in a sukkah. So once I make it, it was less than 10, and now I make it 10, now it's officially considered a fence. So that's sufficient, and it sounds like even if it's just a little bit, if it was like 9, and now I added one more, and now it's 10, so that makes it, that's a little bit, that makes it a wall, and I acquire it. Or if I break it, how much is a little bit? Enough to go in and out from that breach. In other words, if I just make a 2-inch breach, and that's not called a breach because I still can't go in and out. It doesn't have to be a huge one, but it has to be, I don't know, a foot big, or a foot and a half big, so that a person could fit through it. That would be sufficient. And as long as it's that big, that's what's kol shehu. Kol shehu doesn't literally mean, 1 centimeter, 1 millimeter. It means enough to make it up to 10, or enough that you can go in and out. That's Shmuel's statement. But we're going to define this further in the next 2 paragraphs. Hai gader hechidame ilema demikara lo havu salkila vehashta nami la salkila mai avad. So exactly what is the case regarding building a wall? If at first it was high enough that one could not climb over it, and then you made it higher, and obviously by making it higher, you still can't climb over it. So then what have you done? Right? Just by adding something. I mean, Shmuel seems to have given the example of it was 8 or 9, and then you made it 10. But what if it's like already high, and now you just made it higher? Is that going to be anything? You're not really adding anything useful to the fence by making it even higher than it is, because even beforehand you couldn't climb over it. So that seems like it wouldn't count. And if at first one could easily go over this little fence, it was just a tiny fence, and then he made it higher such that one could not go over it. Right beforehand you could go over it, and now it's so high that you can't get over it. Well, then that's not called kol shehu. That would be a big deal, that you did a lot. So what is the Mishnah talking about? How could it be a kol shehu that you add a little and still it can't make no difference, because then it's not doing anything, but it can't make a huge difference because then it wouldn't be called kol shehu. So what case is the Mishnah assuming? La siricha de mikarahavu salkila beravcha vashta kasalkila bedochka. Must be a case where at first one could easily go over the fence, but now one can go over it, but it would take some effort. It doesn't mean that obviously if you could go over it before easily, and now you can't get over it at all, that's obviously you're doing something significant and you would acquire the field. But that's not the case that the Mishnah is assuming, because the Mishnah said a kol shehu. So if you're just adding a little, then it must be beforehand. You could easily get over the fence, and now you could still get over the fence, but with some difficulty. So this could be understood as a standalone commentary on the Mishnah, but it also can fit into Shmuel, because that would make sense. When something is 10 tefachim high, that's not so high. It's like 3 feet, so you could get over it. But it's more difficult to get over if it's 3 feet than if it's only 2 feet. 2 feet, you could really just step right over it. 3 feet already, you have to do a little climbing. It'll be somewhat of a deterrent. So this statement would make sense for Shemuel if something was 7 or 8 tefachim, and then you made it 10. So then beforehand it was easy to get over, and now you're making it somewhat harder to get over. That's called kol shehu. And now the other way, hai pirsa hechidami. What is a case of breaking a fence? If it's that beforehand it was easy to get in and out, and now it's also easy to get in and out. Let's say there was a 3-foot hole in the fence, and now you made it a 4-foot hole. Well, 3-foot hole, I could already get in and out. A breach in the fence, so 4 feet doesn't make it any better, any worse of a fence by having a bigger hole than is already there. But if the fence beforehand I could not get through it at all, and now I made a nice big hole and now I can get through it, that wouldn't be called kol shehu. I mean, yes, you would acquire the fence if you made there was no hole and now there's a big breach in it. But you wouldn't call that kol shehu, so that can't be the case that the Mishnah is assuming. Rather, the Mishnah must be talking about a case where beforehand I was able to get through it. There was a few inches of space, and if I held my stomach in and really squeezed, and then I would be able to get through the breach in the fence. So, and then I came and I made it bigger, so that I can get through with ease without having to squeeze through. That's called kol shehu. So kol shehu is not as little as just like making it 1 millimeter wider, but rather has to be something. I'm doing something that is a little bit significant, making it easier to get through or harder to get over in the case of building the fence. Good. Amar Rav Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Natan seror v'ho'il, v'natal seror v'ho'il, harezo chazaka. So Rabbi Yochanan is giving a different definition than Shemuel. Shemuel says you made it up to 10, or you broke it so that you can go in and out. So that's how he defined how do you make a chazakah, and then we had to explain, well, how could that be called kol shehu? So we explained it's called kol shehu because it's not that you couldn't get out at all before, now you can, but rather you could get out with difficulty, and now you can do it easily. But to fit Shemuel into the Mishnah, we had to come up with these scenarios in order to figure out how doing a small kol shehu, a small act, can still be considered to fit into Shemuel's definition. But Rabbi Yochanan says it has an easier way. There are cases where you can just move one little stone, and that will be considered making a chazakah, because it does in fact do something significant. As follows: if you put a stone and ho'il, and it helps the field in some way, or you take away a stone and it helps the field in some way, then that's a chazakah. That's all Rabbi Yochanan said. But let's think about what kind of scenario moving a stone would help. May natan umay natal. What does that mean? You're putting it there and taking it away. Ile natan seror uschar mayamina. Natal seror va'pek mayamina. Hayai mabriach arim nichsecha verohu. If this stone is preventing a flood, for example, you put a stone so that you stop the water from flooding the field. Water is coming in from some channel and it's going to flood the field, and so you put a stone there and stop it. So now you save the field from flooding. Or there's a lot of water in a field and you remove a stone, like you remove a plug that's from a drain. So once you remove that stone, then all the water drains out and it won't be flooded. Now, if that's the case, now that is certainly a significant improvement with a small act, However, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're the owner, because even if you're not the owner, if you see that someone is in trouble or their property is in trouble, you have an obligation to go do something and save them. It's like chasing away a lion from someone else's property. If you see a lion threatening someone or their property, you should chase it away. Obviously, you have to keep yourself safe. If you can do it in a safe way, you should, and you must do that. That's simply v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. You're returning someone's lost property by doing so. And therefore, if I go and I remove a stone to unflood your field, that doesn't mean it's mine. It means I'm fulfilling my obligation as a good neighbor to help out your field. So it can't be talking about that case. Ela natan seror v'desamad lamaya. Natal seror v'arvach lamaya. Rather has to be that I move a stone in such a way that it irrigates the field, right? Not too much water that's flooded, but a good amount of water that will be positive for it. So either I place a stone, and such that placing the stone will connect water, and the water from a nice channel of water will come and water the field, right? I put a stone in some place that holds something in place so that the water will flow nicely. Or if the water channel is blocked up and I remove the stone, and now it's flowing nicely and irrigating the field. If I do that, well, a neighbor wouldn't do that, right? So if I'm just a neighbor and I see, oh, you need to irrigate your field, so I don't have an obligation to come irrigate your field. You'll come now, you'll come later, and you'll irrigate your own field. It's not like an emergency. So in this case, if I'm coming and irrigating a certain field, and you also obviously gave me permission, and you said go acquire it, or you gave it to me as a gift. So as long as I do this productive act, which a passing by neighbor wouldn't do, it's not like scaring away a lion, but rather something that improves the land, that's called a chazakah. That's Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. V'amar Rav Aseh amar Rabbi Yochanan. So now another halacha in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Shete sadot umeser echad benehen. Hechezik be'achat mehen liknota kena'a. So we have a case of two fields that are next to each other, and there's a boundary marker between them. The boundary marker might be, let's say, a pile of stones, right? Let's say this screen is one big area, and there's a field on the left side, and there's a field on the right side, and in the middle, there's a row of stones that represents a boundary marker between them. Okay, so now these fields are just there. They don't belong to anybody, and I want to go and acquire them, or they belong to someone, and I'm going to buy it from that person. I want to do a chazakah. So the halacha is, if I do a chazakah on the left one, right, I close the gate or do something on the left one, then I acquire the left one. Or if I do it on the right one, I acquire the right one, but only the right one. Okay. Liknot ota et chaberta, ota kana, chaberta lo kana. Now let's say I do an act of acquisition on the left one, right? I plow something, improve the left side of the field, and I have in mind, by doing this, I want to acquire the entire, both fields, the one on the right as well. Does that work? The answer is no, it does not work, because they're not one field. There's a boundary marker in between that separates them. So therefore, I have to do a separate act on the left one and another act on the right one. Liknot et chaberta afota lo kana. Now, if I do an act on the left field, not in order to acquire the left field, but rather to acquire the right field. I'm doing the act on the left, and I have in mind, by doing this act, I will gain the right. Well, that doesn't work at all. Not only do I not gain the right, that we knew already, because you can't do it, from a long distance. But then I don't even acquire the left, because I didn't have intention to acquire the left. So the bottom line is, I have to do the act on the field that I am intending to acquire, and you can't do it from long distance. So since there's a boundary marker, I'll have to make an acquisition on the left for the left, and on the right for the right. Okay, simple enough. But now we ask some more complicated questions. Ba'er bi zera. Hechazik ba'achat mehen liknot ota ve'et ha'meser ve'et chaberta mahu. Mi amrinan meser dar achad hu ve'kaneh, o dilma hay lechudeh ka'eh ve'hay lechudeh ka'eh. Teko. What if, same scenario, and I make an act of acquisition on the left side of the field. I dig a furrow, I open the gate over here, breach the wall on the left side of the field, but I do this having intention to acquire that field on the left, and also the boundary marker, and also the field on the right. What about in that case? Would that work? Because this is different from before. Now I want to acquire the boundary marker also. So here's the two sides of the argument. You could say maybe the boundary marker is all one with the land. And because if I have in mind just the left land and the right land, but not the boundary marker, well, then the boundary marker is a separation. That was what Rabbi Yochanan said before. But maybe the boundary marker I can consider as being one with the rest of the land, and as long as I have them all in mind, I can do an act over here and acquire the entire thing, this land and the boundary marker and the other side of the land, that they're all considered one. If I consider them as one, and therefore I only have to do one acquisition on one part of it. That's one side of it. Or do I say, no, this field is alone and the boundary marker is a separate thing and the other field is also a separate thing, and you can't connect them. You can't do one for the other. Rather, you'd have to make a separate acquisition for this and a separate acquisition for this, and technically, if you wanted to again own the boundary line itself, you'd have to do an acquisition on that also. He leaves this question unanswered. Another question. Ba'e Rabbi Elazar, hechezik b'meser liknot shetehen mahu. Mi amrinan hai meser afsera dar ahu v'kaneh, or dirma hai lichudeh v'ka'eh v'hai lichudeh ka'eh tekol. So if we assume that in this case, one cannot just make an acquisition on one field and assume that that brings along with it also the boundary marker and the other field, we consider them all as one. If you say you can't do that because they're separate, what about if I do the act of acquisition on the boundary marker? I go to the boundary marker and, I move some things over there, I improve it, I raise it up, I do something on the boundary marker, and now I own the boundary. Okay, so good. Now, by doing that, can I also bring along with it ownership of both of the fields? Well, here's why you would say yes. Maybe it's like the halter of an animal, like the reins. When you want to acquire an animal, there's different ways you can do it. You can move the animal, pull it or push it. That is one way to do it. Then you have to actually then move the animal. But another way to do it is to hold on to its reins, because its reins control the animal. So therefore, even without touching the animal at all, just holding the reins, its halter, the halter is part that goes on its mouth, that acquires the animal. So should we compare the boundary marker to a halter? And the boundary marker is kind of like the reins of the land. And so since I did a chazakah, an act on the boundary marker, I can thereby also acquire both of the lands on the sides. Interesting argument. Or do we say, no, these are all separate things, and it's not like something that you move the halter and then the animal moves it, controls it. These are three separate areas, and then I would have to do separate acquisitions on the fields besides on the boundary. Teko, we leave this question also unanswered. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Abu, Shene batim, ze lifnim mize, hechezik b'chison liknoto kenao, liknot oto v'eta penimi, chison kana, penimi lo kana, liknot eta penimi, af chison name lo kana. So now we have a related question with a similar case, but there's an important difference between this case of two houses compared to the two fields that are side by side. Here we have two houses. One is within the other. In other words, let's say here, this is a whole thing is a courtyard, and on the left side here is an opening. Now you go into the opening and you enter the home. There's a home over here. That's the outside home, and that outside home is connected to another home that's over here. That's the inside home. In order to get to the inside home, you have to walk through the outside home to get there. There's no separate entrance to the inside home. So it's like two apartments, but there's only one entrance, and this guy, the inside guy, has to walk through the outside. The outside guy can just get there directly because his opening opens directly onto the street. Okay, so you have two houses, one inside the other, and someone wants to acquire them. from someone else or from hefker, he has to make an act of chazakah. If he makes an act of acquisition on the outside one in order to acquire the outside one, that works, right? He goes to the outside one and he does something, he locks the door or uses it in a way that an owner would, then he acquires the outside one. That's a simple case. If he liknot oto veta penimi, chitzon kana penimi lo kana. If he does an act of acquisition on the outside one in order to acquire both the outside one and the inside one, that does not work. He gets the outside one, that's fine, because he did the act in the outside one, but not the inside one, because the inside one is independent. The outside one is not dependent on the inside one. The other way is true. The inside one is dependent on the outside one because you need to get through. But the outside one is standalone. You can own only the outside one and never have to go into the inside one. And therefore, that will work to only acquire the outside and not the inside. This would be the same as the two fields side by side. I did an acquisition on one. Even if I had in mind the other one, it doesn't work. If I did an act of acquisition on the outside one, having in mind that I'm not going to acquire the outside, but rather for the inside one, then I don't get anything at all. The inside one I don't get because I didn't do an act of acquisition there. And the outside one I don't get because I didn't have in mind that I wanted to acquire the outside one. We continue. If I went into the inside one and I did an act of acquisition in the inside one in order to acquire the inside one, then I get the inside one alone. That's all I had in mind, and I did it there. That's good. And here's the big chidush: liknot oto vet hachison kana shenehen. If I go into the inside one and I do an act of acquisition in the inside home, having in mind that I want to acquire both of them, the inside and the outside, that works. You know why? Because the outside is dependent on the inside is dependent on the outside. In order to get to the inside, I have to go through the outside. So if I acquire the inside one and have in mind to acquire both, that works because implied in owning the inside one is permission to go through the outside one, and therefore, as long as I have in mind for both, I acquire both. Liknot et hachison af penimi lo kana. But if I go to the inside one and acquire and do an act of acquisition, having in mind to acquire only the outside one, then I don't get anything. I don't get the inside one because I didn't have in mind to acquire it. I don't get the outside one because I didn't acquire the inside one. I can only acquire the outside one if I own the inside one. And thereby, by getting the inside one and having in mind also the outside one, and since I need to go through it, therefore I acquire both. But if I never got the inside one, then I can't get the outside one either. Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Bar Abu Habone Pelatrin Gedolim Benichse Hager Uba Acher Ve'emid Lahen Delatot Kana Mai Ta'ama Kama Libne Be'alma Hu De'apich. So Rabba says the name of Rabba Bar Abu that, let's say there's a field that belonged to a convert, and the convert died without heirs. So now this is a free-for-all. Whoever goes and does a chazakah on that land first will acquire it. So an easy way to do that would be to lock the gate if it has a gate around it, or do something to improve that land. Well, say you have a guy who goes and he builds a big palace, platrin. This is a Greek word that's the same as the root as palatial, we say today, or palace. So he builds a palace, a large palace on that field. He does not acquire it, as the Gemara says. What's the reason? The first guy does not acquire it because he's just turning bricks around. He's moving bricks. He's taking this, he puts it on top. So just building bricks, just building a wall is not an act of acquisition because it's still not called a home. So you're just making piles of bricks. That doesn't count. However, if after the first guy builds all the walls, someone else comes and just hangs up a door, then the guy who puts the door on, he acquires all of the land, because now by putting the door, by putting that finishing touch, that turns a pile of bricks into a home, into a palace, into something that is nice and useful. So it's not about how much work you do, it's about the quality of that work. And so just building walls does not make a chazakah, but putting a finishing touch on something that's already there does make a chazakah. A similar example, Amar Rav Dimi bar Yosef Amar Rabbi Elazar, Hamoseh pilatrin benichseh hager, v'sad behen siyud echad o kiyor echad kenaan, v'chama Amar Rav Yosef Amma, Amar Rav Chisda ucheneged hapetach. So Rav Dimi, the son of Yosef, says in the name of Rabbi Elazar, if you're walking around and you see a palace that belonged to a convert who died without heirs, and there's already a palace there, and it's not owned by nobody. So whoever makes a chazakah will get it for himself. So what does this guy do? You go and you plaster a certain section, or you tile a little section, then you acquired it. Why? Because plastering and tiling are also finishing touches, right? That's what you do at the end when you're finished the building, the walls themselves. So it's not about the building, but about the finishing touches. So just like adding a door, so too putting some tiles on or putting some plaster on. We would say like, the final paint finish. Vechama. So how much do you need to do? Is it even just like one little dab of plaster? No, an amma, a square cubit worth of tile or plaster. That's a significant amount of finishing that now you acquire it. And Rav Chisda says it has to be near the entrance where it can be seen. Then it's considered significant. If you put a little bit of plaster right somewhere in the attic where nobody's there looking anyway, so then that's not considered finishing, only if it's something that is nice and noticeable. Amar Rav Amram, Hai mileta Amar lan Rav Sheshat, Vanhiru Ainan mimatnita. Rav Amram says the following matter, this is also going to be talking about how to acquire an item. So that's how it's related to what before. So he says the following matter, halacha, was taught to us by Rav Sheshat, and not only did he teach us the halacha, but also he enlightened our eyes from a baraita. In other words, he taught us an interesting halacha, and he brought a baraita that proves it, that helped us understand that baraita and its connection to this halacha in a way that was not obvious, because the halacha and the baraita seem to be talking about two different things. Okay, here's the halacha. Hamasiya masaot benichseh hager kana. Let's say you have, again, a convert who died without heirs, and he wants to do an act of acquisition. If one spreads out mattresses or cushions on the land, and it seems he would also have to lie down on the mattresses, that is considered an act of acquisition. So again, it's not the usual one that we were talking about before of locking the gate, but or improving the land, but this is a certain usage of the land. Now, we want to prove that this type of usage, lying down on something, putting your weight on something, on the mattresses, or putting the mattresses there themselves, meaning you're making it ready to use in that way of lying down on. How do we know that that's considered a type of acquisition? Vanhidu anin mimatnita. So he says, yes, it is an act of acquisition, and he enlightened our eyes from a baraita that he connected to this halacha. Maihi detanya. What is the baraita? The following one. Kesad behazaka. We're talking about an eved Kena'ani. If someone is transferring a Canaanite slave to someone else, you have to do an act of acquisition. Even if they agreed to it orally, you actually have to do something. So how do you acquire an eved Kena'ani? Through chazakah. It means you have to use the slave in a way that a master would use a slave, right? Just like with land, you have to use it in a way that an owner would. So now we have lots of examples. Lo min alo, or hetir lo min alo. If the slave puts on the master's shoe or takes off the master's shoe, this is a typical service that the servant would do for a master. And that's it. He just has to do that once, and that's considered an act of acquisition. Or shelich kelav achalav lebet hamerchas v'fshito v'hirchiso sacho gerado hilbisho v'hin'ilo v'higbiho kena'o. Or if the servant carries the clothing of the master to the bathhouse, he carries his towels, he carries his change of clothes. That's a typical thing a servant would do. Or if he undresses his master master, or washes his master, or puts oil on his master's skin, or scrapes the oil off. That's how they would clean themselves. They didn't take baths that often, and so the dirt built up, so they would clean themselves by putting oil all over the skin, massaging it around, and then taking a metal scraper and scraping off the oil and the layer of dirt that was on their skin. And so if a person was wealthy, he would have his servant do that for him, or if the servant then dresses him or puts his shoes on. We already had shoes, but shoes would be done on a daily basis, taking your shoes on and off, and here it's within the series of things that a servant would do in the bathhouse. Okay, so all those are acts of acquisition, and here's the key one that we need: if he lifted him. Now, it doesn't say who lifted who, but you see from the context, it's talking about if the servant lifted the master. The master needed to get up into some high place, maybe as a high bed, or he needed to get over on top of something, and the servant picks up the master. That's a way of serving the master by picking him up, and all that is also considered an act of acquisition. Good. Amar Rabbi Shimon. The Baraita continues. That was Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon says, Lo techazaka gedola mehagbaha, shehagbaha kona bechol makom. Rabbi Shimon says that there's no greater chazaka than lifting up, because lifting up something acquires in all places. Anytime I want to acquire an item, if I'm buying a book from you, so just paying for it is not enough. I have to pick up the book. So picking something up is the standard way of acquiring things in all situations. So here, the word picking something up actually seems to have the opposite meaning, that it's the master that's picking up the slave. Just like you can pick up an item, an immovable, inanimate item, so too, if he picks up the slave, this slave is mine. Picks him up, right, and then he acquires him. Okay, so now we just want to explain how is the Tanakama different from Rabbi Shimon? They're both talking about picking things up, but do they disagree? They're talking about in opposite ways. Tanakama was talking about the servant picking up the master. Rabbi Shimon is talking about the master picking up the servant. So that's what we're going to explain. My Kamad, Hachi Kamad, Higbiho lerabo kenao, Higbiya rabo lo kenao. The Tanakama says that if the servant picked up the master, that's considered an act of acquisition, because that's a service. Just like putting on his clothes, putting on his shoes, picking someone up, that's something that a servant would do for his master. However, if the master picked up the servant, Tanakama says, no, that doesn't work. That's not a service that the master does that the servant does for the master, and master shouldn't be serving the servant, and so it doesn't work that way. And to that, Amar Rabbi Shimon, Lo techazaka gedola mehagbaha, shehagbaha kona bechol makom. Rabbi Shimon says that chazaka should not be stronger than lifting up, because lifting an item up in all places acquires it. And therefore, Rabbi Shimon is expanding the definition, says, yes, not only if the slave picks up the master, that's considered service, and the master acquires the servant thereby, but Rabbi Shimon says, chazaka is not going to be stronger than picking up the item that you want to acquire, because you can always pick up the item that you want to acquire, and therefore the other way around also works. So according to Rabbi Shimon, if the master picks up the slave, well, he's not the master yet, some guy who's acquiring the slave picks up the slave, then he acquires him. That's the end of the Braita. Now, how is this Braita a proof for the statement of Rav Sheshat? Well, it's as follows. It comes from the lifting of when the servant lifts up the master. When he's doing that, the weight of the master is upon the servant, right? And yet that's a usage. You can use a person here, or a piece of land. One way of using something is by placing your weight upon that person. So if I have a servant and I go on his back and he picks me up and my weight is upon him, I'm lying on him or standing on him, that's considered usage, and I acquire the slave who's underneath. And that's the same thing as a piece of land. If I want to go acquire this piece of land, of course, there's lots of different ways to do it, but one of the ways would be if I put mattresses mattresses there, and I'm lying down on the mattresses. I'm putting my weight on the land. That is also a way of acquiring it. So Rav Amram said, Rav Sheshet, he taught us a fantastic halacha, and he connected it. We never would have made this connection ourselves. He compared the acquisition of land to the acquisition of slaves, in that both one puts their weight on it. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.